Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. It is again good to be here with you, to receive, as I do, friendly welcome from people I've met before. This year, let me say, it has given particular pleasure to hear the readings read by family duets. That has not only been well done, but it's a very important symbol of their continuity of parents and children in church together. But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Martha, however, has not lost her place of honour. When the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires was elected Pope, he chose to move nowhere from the hotel or residence which had been built for the cardinals meeting to choose a pope were living, and not to occupy the papal apartments. It was St. Martha's house, and it is in Casa San Marta that Pope Francis still remains. She is therefore not without recognition. Mary and Martha occur in John's Gospel too. Luke's book was written sometime after Mark and Matthew, and sometime before John, the last of the four. But it is in St. John's Gospel that we meet Mary and Martha's brother, Lazarus, and read of Lazarus' illness and death, and his being raised to life, together with Jesus speaking of his own death and his being the resurrection and the life. But over 40 verses in the 11th chapter of the Gospel according to St. John are matched, if that is the word, by 5 verses in the 10th chapter of Luke's Gospel. Luke connects Martha and Mary to the Good Samaritan, which he has just told. The priest and the Levite were following the regulations of the old Hebrew law, not to touch dead bodies, and therefore to keep their regulation and duty in the temple. But the Samaritan was following the more important law, to love your neighbour. So Mary is presented as following the call to love God, to listen to the word of God and his prophets. The position of women in the culture of the first century is often discussed in comments on the story of Martha and Mary. Turning to Daphne Hampson's Theology and Feminism, we read that it would seem that the notion that women should only fulfill a domestic role is questioned. Mary is allowed to sit at the feet of a rabbi, at Jesus' feet. But there is no suggestion that the men should on this occasion do the work of preparing the food. Moreover, what is the picture that we are given, she says? Mary was hardly being intellectual in any creative way or initiating any original ideas of her own by sitting at Jesus' feet and listening. If the story were to be useful to feminists, one would have thought that it would have to show role reversal. It would need to concern on this occasion a man sitting at a woman's feet and learning from her. But that is unthinkable in the context. The story does not even portray a dialogue between two equals. The image we are given simply serves to confirm the picture of Jesus, of teacher and listener, given to men and women respectively within a patriarchal order. So Daphne Hampson, who was a lecturer in theology in St Andrews. I wonder if there are two statements about Martha and Mary which might be shared by a fair proportion of Christian people. The first, that Jesus was a man of his time, influenced by contemporary culture and assumptions. And the second, that he might have been kinder to Martha, who was after all preparing his supper. As regards the second statement, we have to remember the Gospels are not social reports of a 21st century sort, nor biographies, but Gospels, manifestos promoting Christianity. To follow the first statement, that Jesus was a man of his time, we could readily note that as the centuries of Christian witness have passed, at no time could it be said that the social, political, and general culture had no influence on what the church taught or how it behaved. Equally, it could be claimed that there has always been a resistance to any thoughtless, uncritical acceptance of popular culture. Both have been there, the influence of culture and some resistance to culture. A minister I know had his first charge in an English rural parish, where the custom at communion was that the squire came forward, knelt and received, and only when she had got back to her seat did anyone else, which was everybody else, come forward. There was some culture affecting and influencing the behavior of the church. Musing on the influence of culture on religion, I went back to a book I read 20 years ago on 500 years of religion in America by the Chicago church historian and writer Martin E. Marty, a splendid and highly readable survey of all the churches and religious activities from Christopher Columbus to Billy Graham. But I was drawn to it in preparation of this sermon by the book's title, Pilgrims in Their Own Land, which seemed to suggest that American Christianity had been influenced or even determined by the vision and thrust of the development of the United States. It was therefore with particular pleasure that I rediscovered, printed before the first chapter, this paragraph by Jacques Maritain, the French philosopher who lived and taught in North America in the middle years of the 20th century. Americans, he writes, seem to be in their own land as pilgrims, prodded by a dream. They are always on the move, available for new tasks, prepared for the possible loss of what they have. They are not settled, installed. This sense of becoming, this sense of the flux of time and the dominion of time over everything here below, can be interpreted, of course, he writes, in merely pragmatist terms. It can turn into a worship of becoming and change. It can develop a cast of mind which, in the intellectual field, would mean a horror of any tradition, the denial of any lasting or supra-temporal value. But such a cast of mind is but a degeneration of the inner mood of which I am speaking. In its genuine significance, he writes that this American mood seems to me to be close to Christian detachment, to the Christian sense of the impermanence of earthly things. Those now with us must fade away if better ones are to appear. Martin Marty covers the building of the Californian missions by Father Junipero and the spread of church life from Britain, with Baptists scoring as the frontier grew when they could set up a local church and ordain a minister without waiting for a bishop or a presbytery. The evangelical threat of early 19th century, the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists, Mrs. Eddy, and more. Then, towards the end of his long pilgrimage, he quotes the philosopher John Dewey in a matter which has to me been badly neglected: the use or overuse of the word God in Christian circles. When Dewey wrote in the 1930s of his own long struggle with specialized religious belief, and his view that the word God should mean nothing more or nothing less than the idea that the whole self could be harmonized with the universe. I don't know if I'd go along with all that, but I do suspect that we overuse the word God and therefore heighten the barrier to religious involvement for those who have been told that God is unavoidably central. Two things in past years moved me in that direction. The first was probably in 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the first non-communist, active Catholic Prime Minister of Poland was sworn into office. And he was asked, in such a changing situation, with a different set of beliefs, how would he manage? And his reply was, "We believe in providence, and providence is kind." And that reminded me that from Old Testament times and the Psalms through the whole history of the Church, there have been many words for the divine, the Holy One, the Shepherd of Israel. He will bear thee up with wings as an eagle. And not just this proper name use of one word. And the other memory was when the first group of church people from the then Soviet Union, this was earlier than 89, visited Britain. And I took part in a service in which they took part. The preacher was a theologian from what was then called Leningrad, and he spoke in Russian, and each sentence was translated by their translator, who was a lady in a fur coat, I remember. And I thought she was there to look after them anyway. But I was able to hear what he said more clearly because of the gap that came between each sentence. And over again, when we might have said God, he said the Holy Trinity, the Blessed Trinity, and other phrases. It seemed to me that we were being taught that people can stumble over God, meaning almost Mr. God, or even the Reverend Mr. God, when in fact it's a more mysterious reference. And there's a lot to be said for providence and Holy Trinity and other terms. Luke's 5 short verses containing Martha and Mary can open a door to a wide consideration of the interplay of culture and faith, from ancient Hebrew times through the development of the Church in America to ourselves here today, where compromise and semi-fidelity can daily threaten our loyalty to Christ and his cause. And though we are unlikely in this life to evade or escape the influence of the wide culture in which we live, it may be helpful to bear in mind the risk we run by living as we are. Amen.